35th President John F. Kennedy was one of 4 brothers, all of whom had presidential ambitions. From oldest to youngest, the brothers were Joseph, John, Robert, and Edward. All had tried to become president or desired the position, and for every presidential election from 1956 to 1980, a Kennedy would be in the national discussions for either president or vice president. But the idea of a Kennedy presidency was around long before even 1956. It started with their father, the family patriarch, businessman, and politician Joseph Kennedy Sr. had long desired the presidency for himself, but eventually he looked to his children to fulfill the dream. Joe planned for all of his sons to eventually serve as president. It was beyond ambitious. America had never elected a brother of a president to the same office, let alone repeated the feat 2 more times. The closest familial pairs in presidential history were the father-son pair of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and the grandfather-grandson pair of William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison. Joe accepted the challenge and even boasted that he would outdo the Adams family. The heaviest expectations were on the eldest son, Joseph, or Joe Jr., who would make the way for the rest of them. Since the day he was born, Joe Jr. was being groomed for his role. Shortly after his birth, his grandfather, the former mayor of Boston, declared to a reporter that Joe Jr. would be the president one day, that the boy's parents had already decided on it. The path was laid out by his father. Joe Jr. was to earn decorations through military service, enter politics through the House of Representatives, and climb the political ladder and eventually be elected president. Joe Sr. had the means to make this possible. Throughout his life, he'd accumulated tremendous wealth and valuable connections, which he'd used to secure his son's future. However, he didn't want his son to rely on these alone. He also expected a vigorous work ethic and a competitive attitude. None of this was a problem for Joe Jr. He would often brag that he would become president without the aid of his father, but simply on his own merits. He did well in academics and sports and was highly competitive with his peers. In 1941, he joined the Navy at age 26, an early step in his path to the presidency. However, it's as far as he ever got. 3 years into his service, he was killed in a plane accident. He'd planned to run for the House of Representatives in 1946. However, the most he'd ever accomplished in politics was serving as a delegate at the 1940 Democratic National Convention. The ambitions of their father then fell on the shoulders of the second eldest son. John, or Jack as he was nicknamed since his youth, ended up following the path made for his older brother. Jack already had military experience under his belt, having served in the Navy during World War II. In 1946, a year after he came back from the Navy, he ran for and won the congressional seat that was meant for Joe Jr. He eventually moved on to the United States Senate and in 1960 was elected President of the United States. Less than 3 years into his term, he was killed by an assassin, leaving his younger brother Robert to take up the mantle. Robert, nicknamed Bobby, was the third son and the runt of the boys. Joe Sr. had less interest in him than the other two. This was partially because so much attention was given to Joe Jr. and Jack, who were 10 and 8 years older than Bobby, but also because Joe Sr. saw Bobby as soft and too compassionate. However, over the years, Bobby would become, according to his father, tough as nails, and earned a respectable career in his own right. He served in the Naval Reserve from 1944 to 1946, then became a lawyer at age 26 and worked on the political campaigns of his older brother. During Jack's presidency, Bobby served as Attorney General. He was 38 years old when Jack was assassinated. The remainder of Jack's term passed to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who then ran for his own term in 1964. Voters overwhelmingly favored Bobby as Johnson's running mate. However, the mutual hatred between Bobby and Johnson would never allow for this to happen. Thus, Bobby would have to wait his turn, but it looked like he wouldn't be waiting long. At the 1964 Democratic National Convention, Bobby spoke in tribute to his fallen brother. Receiving a 22-minute applause from the audience, he was perhaps more the star of the show than the actual candidate was. At only 38, he had never been elected to a public office, but he was dead set on the presidency and ready to speed through the steps to get there. Immediately after it was confirmed he wouldn't be picked as Johnson's running mate, he planned to become either the governor of Massachusetts or senator of New York, depending on, quote, which would be a better place from which to make a run for the presidency in future years. He ended up winning the New York Senate race and took his seat in 1965. Just 3 years into his 6-year term, he announced his run for the 1968 Democratic Party presidential nomination. By comparison, Jack had served 3 terms in the House of Representatives and more than 1 full term in the Senate prior to becoming president, but Bobby wanted the fast track. As a sort of self-anointed warrior for justice, Bobby was moved by what he saw as injustices throughout the nation that he didn't believe anyone else had the grit to fix. However, he was also impatient to avenge his brother's legacy and reclaim what he saw as the family's rightful office. His goals were doubly ambitious as he was challenging an incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, for the party's nomination. Bobby was running almost solely on his own ambition. As reported by Bobby himself, almost everyone around him advised him not to run. The politically astute were worried about the fallout from challenging an incumbent, and his family were worried he might suffer the same fate as Jack. Also, unlike Joe Jr. and Jack, he was taking up the mantle without the pushing of his father. In 1961, Joe Sr. had suffered a stroke, which left him disabled and unable to speak. Early in 1968, Bobby told his father of his intentions to run, and Joe just dropped his head in disapproval. At this point, he didn't want his remaining sons to be president, he just wanted them to live. In the primaries, Bobby performed well. As President Johnson ultimately declined to run for a second term, Bobby ran against Senator Eugene McCarthy and Vice President Hubert Humphrey. While Humphrey was favored to win the nomination, Kennedy's performance in the primaries was making him more and more a serious contender. However, on June 5th, after giving a victory speech celebrating his win in California, he was shot several times. He died the following day. It was about 2 months before the Democratic National Convention, and to this day, people still debate whether or not Bobby would have become the party's candidate had he lived. For the Kennedy family, however, the mantle now passed to the youngest son. Edward, nicknamed Ted, was not only the youngest of the Kennedy boys, but of all of Joe's children. There were 17 years between Ted and Joe Jr. and 7 years between Ted and Bobby. Ted had big shoes to fill, but he seemed to be filling them well. At just 30, he was elected to his first term in the United States Senate. The same had only been accomplished by Jack at 36 and Bobby at 40. Ted also had experience campaigning for both of his brothers. In 1960, he campaigned for Jack in western states and was successful in connecting with ordinary people. According to many, this was a key to Jack winning the Democratic nomination against Lyndon Johnson, a political titan at the time. Ted also supported Bobby in his 1968 campaign. However, when it came time to take up the Kennedy mantle, he hesitated. At Bobby's death in June of '68, Ted was just 36. Almost immediately after leaving the hospital where Bobby died, Ted was looked at to be the next Kennedy president, to jump in the race, win the Democratic nomination that was less than 3 months away, and be elected president in November. It was much to carry at such a young age. It's true Jack had only been 26 when his brother died, but he still had his father to guide him. When Jack died, Bobby was only 38, but at least he still had his brother at his side. When Bobby died, Ted was on his own. His father died in 1969, less than a year and a half after Bobby's death. Though Joe Sr. had planned for Ted to be president like the others, he was far less active in rearing him for the role. While the others were the objects of Joe Sr.'s ambition, Ted was more the object of his affection. It's perhaps why he never saw Ted as runt the same way he saw Bobby, even though Ted was even softer than Bobby. It also might have been why Ted never had the same complex or ambition as the rest of the boys. Also, Ted wasn't only taking on the role of heir to the presidency, but also of being the only man in his family, a role he hadn't been equipped for. Even Bobby had struggled with becoming the man of the family after Jack's death. The agreeable Ted was hardly equipped for the role, let alone juggling the role with a presidential run. Thus, he declined to take up Bobby's place in the 1964 primaries. Tormented by the death of his closest brother and ill-prepared for his new duties, Ted also recognized the implausibility of the run. 36 was only 1 year older than the minimum age for candidates. Only one major party candidate had ever been so young, William Jennings Bryan, in 1896, and he lost that election. Such a prospect might have been only more fuel for the fiery Bobby or the ambitious Jack, but Ted simply didn't have the drive. Many wanted him to at least be running mate to the eventual candidate, but he declined this as well. Ted continued to be discussed and even pushed as a candidate for the 1972 and 1976 nominations. Pressure only grew as the party struggled through a malaise in the 70s, formed from a lack of solid leadership and bitter factional divides. Ted was looked at as a potential unifier, but he repeatedly declined. A large part of his reasoning was personal. He was now the surrogate father of 11 children from his 2 brothers, and the father of 3 children of his own, 2 of which suffered serious health concerns during the 70s. Furthermore, any time he talked of running, his family pressured him against it, fearing he'd suffer the same fate of his brothers, a fear Ted also harbored. His situation was complicated further by a massive scandal known as the Chappaquiddick incident. In July 1969, a year after Bobby's death, Ted was involved in a car accident in which his car drove off a narrow bridge and ended up overturned in a pond, resulting in the death of his passenger. Ted left the scene and didn't report the accident, leading to a trial and nationwide controversy. The incident followed him for the rest of his political career and the rest of his life. For many Democrats, the incident made him a non-viable candidate for president altogether. However, in 1980, a decade after Chappaquiddick and after the death of his brother, he declared his campaign for the Democratic nomination. At a glance, it looked similar to Bobby's campaign. Both were campaigns against unpopular incumbents. Bobby had challenged Lyndon Johnson, and Ted was challenging Jimmy Carter. Looking any deeper, however, exposed a clear difference. Ted didn't show the same passion as Bobby, or Jack for that matter. Jack spoke of a lofty vision for the country, and Bobby reignited that vision with a vengeance. Ted seemed uninspired and uncharismatic. When asked point blank why he was running for president, he only gave a meandering response. Many feel as though Ted was only running because it was probably his last best chance. He never had the ambition of the other men in his family. He was rather content with his career in the Senate. Compared to the relatively short tenures of his brothers, Ted had been elected to the same seat 3 times by 1970 and a 4th time by 1976. He eventually lost the nomination to Carter, but not before putting up a good fight. While he won only 12 states to Carter's 36, he captured over 7 million popular votes to Carter's 10 million. In explaining Kennedy's loss, Others point to the shadow of the Chappaquiddick incident, which might have made him unviable as a presidential candidate. Republican and longtime Kennedy family opponent Richard Nixon believed this to be less of a cause and attributed Ted's failure to his lacking the same appeal and inspiration of Jack and Bobby. There was some talk of Ted running again in 1984, but he didn't. After his loss against Carter, Ted won his Senate seat 5 more times and held the seat until his death from natural causes in 2009. 1980 was the last time one of the Kennedy brothers ever ran or was seriously considered as a candidate for the presidency. Joe Sr. had envisioned a Kennedy dynasty where all 4 of his sons would serve as president. Considering the length of presidential terms and term limits, this would have made a Kennedy reign of at least 16 years had each son served a single term, and, if each served 2 terms, of 32 years. In the end, the cumulative Kennedy presidency was only 2 years and 10 months, under the single term of Jack, cut short by an assassin. Despite ambition and effort, none of the other brothers ever made it to the presidency or vice presidency, and while they all achieved notable careers in either the military or in politics, none ever came as far as even winning the Democratic nomination. For more videos like this, consider subscribing to the channel. To show your support and have your name featured in the credits, consider making a donation on Patreon of either $2, $5, or $15 a month. Patreon link in the description below.